Hello everyone, 大家好. Qual vocês? Tamém. Tudo bem, gente? Alguém aqui fala português? Como estamos? Sim, português. Excelente. Thank you. Thank you so much. Great. Now we've focused a lot, I think, on a very academic angle during the majority of the Polyglot Conference. We've had a really academic angle, and I want to pivot a little bit towards the business and technology angles or sectors. So I want to talk about the ways that we, as polyglots, as language people, as a language community, can make an impact through business, through technology, and at the intersection of language and activism. So I am Ariel. I work leading one of the regional marketing teams for Google for Education, which is the team at Google that does education technology work and brings technology to schools. And I also do community impact work at Google Translate. And like everyone here, I'm a proud polyglot. And I want to share some examples and some learnings from my experiences centering multilingualism and centering advocacy for language diversity in the work that I do and through a career in the technology industry. But first, I want to start with a question. So I want to ask everyone, when you hear the word polyglot, cuando escuchan esa palabra políglota, what other words come to mind? Polyglot. What do you guys think of when you hear the word polyglot? First words that come to mind, word association. Freak? Freak, okay. Nerd. Lots of nerds. Huh? Open-minded. Passionate opportunity. Talent.
Curious.
Work. Curious.
Friends.
Having fun. Motivation. Presents? Richard Simcott. Anything else? Crazy. Technology. Okay. So I want everyone to brace yourselves, okay? Brace yourselves, because I asked this question to a large group of diverse friends, colleagues, coworkers, family, acquaintances, random people on the internet, random people on the street. Okay, so I want to share the responses that I got from these people when I asked them, what's the first word that comes to mind when you hear the word polyglot, okay? Prepotente. Arrogant, pretentious. Pretentious. 天才, genius, right? 超级厉害, really awesome. Foda, who speaks Portuguese? Badass. Okay? Smart. Academic. What is that? ¿Qué es eso? ¿C'est quoi? Cerebral. Huh? What? Wait, can you say that again? A ver, ¿qué? Quoi? Intelligent. Is that a geometric shape? I mean, we all occupy space, so yes. Has multiple spouses. There are definitely some polyglots who are polygamous, so not entirely wrong. Como el poliamor, like polyamorous. Nerd. Loyo de amazé. I don't know what that is. I think they exaggerate. A lot of people said, nah, those people don't really speak all those languages. They're like exaggerating. Dedicación. Dedication. Disciplina. Intelectual. Intellectual. Conocedora. Mundial. Worldly. Inteligente. Académico. More academic. Hipercerebral, hypercerebral, prepotente, once again, pretentious, arrogant, mamona. Who knows what mamona is? Snob. Okay, arrogant. So, there's definitely some good stuff in there, like foda, we're badass, we're smart, we're tianzai. You know, there's some positives, but I think overall the takeaway here is that at best, We're perceived as being kind of like those nerds who are in a corner reading books, studying by ourselves, right? Like super cerebral. And at worst, we're perceived as being arrogant, right? Like arrogant and pretentious. So my takeaway here is that the perception is of the polyglot as removed and in kind of our own little bubble. And these descriptors for me were really jarring because they're at complete odds with what I think about when I think of a polyglot. So I want to share the words that come to mind for me when I was sitting through this exercise myself. I first think about access, literal and figurative access. Figurative because when you know more words and you know more languages, you have access to all kinds of different types of ideas, different types of information. And literal access because inherently the label polyglot is elite, right? So it's access to spaces like these spaces. It's access. And with access, I think, comes a relative amount of power. So I think about the word power. And I think with both access and power come privilege. So I think about the word privilege. And then, of course, with great power and great privilege come responsibility. So this is my word association. So I thought about the word social responsibility at the local level, at the global level. And in order to be responsible socially, you have to be conscious socially. So I thought about social consciousness and awareness. I thought about empatía y alcance, empathy and reach. And then I thought, the opposite of removed and in a bubble, I thought integrated and absorbing, right? Like to be a polyglot, it means to be connected, it means to be listening, it means to be engaged, it means to be involved. I thought about anti-racist. I thought about anti-xenophobia. I thought about anti-sexist. I thought about pro-migrante, pro-migration, pro-freedom of mobility. I thought about observer, right? We're listening, which means we're observing, which means we're hearing stories all the time. But more than just observer, we're acting, right? Changer. And I thought of mover and shaker. So I want to propose a bit of a rebranding from the polyglot as removed and in a bubble to the polyglot as a language activist, which I've defined here as a person who focuses energetic action and intense, concentrated energy towards preserving and promoting linguistic democracy and linguistic diversity. Now, this definition is one of what could be infinite definitions, so I hope that over the course of this presentation, everyone will start kind of crafting their own words and their own definitions about what language activism might mean in all of your different personal contexts. And in spite of the fact that we all are going to come up with our own definitions, and there are so many different definitions of what language activism means, I think there are certain actions that define all, if not most, if not many language activists. I think language activists are people who bridge barriers. I heard some of that at the beginning when we did our word association. People who bring people together. People who build new tools. People who speak up. People who speak up amidst injustices, but also people who shut up. People who know when to shut up and stop talking and to just listen. So I think those are some of the actions that I want to be thinking about and that I want to keep really top of mind during this presentation. And why do we need language activism? I want to share some context that for me helps to frame why language-based activism matters and is so important in 2019. So I want everyone to guess this figure. The majority of the internet content in the world is in only 10 languages. I want everyone to guess what percentage of the internet content in the world is in just 10 languages. Ooh, pessimistic bunch here. 80%, still too high, right? So 80% of the web, 80% of the internet content in the world is in only 10 languages, in spite of the fact that there are thousands of languages in the world. Now let's take out the other 9 languages and just focus on English. English accounts for, guess what percentage of the world's internet content? 50. Who said 50? Awesome. 50%. So just one language that's spoken by only 20% of the world's population accounts for half of the world's internet content. So we're talking about the internet, a tool that is meant to democratize information, to make access to the world's information universal. And that tool is actually doing the opposite when you look at it from a language perspective, because just one language is monopolizing the majority of content on the internet. So it's moving us farther from language democracy, which is the concept of equal access to resources, information, mobility, and opportunity for people of any and all mother tongues. So here's some more context that for me is very sobering and grounding when I think about what it means to be a polyglot in 2019. 52% of people in the world only speak one language, and 3.7 billion people face significant language barriers in their daily lives. And that number is only increasing because the global population of migrants is growing faster than the global general population right now. So there are 258 million international migrants in the world, 25.9 million refugees, and 3.5 million asylum seekers. And these numbers are all the highest they've ever been, and they're continuing to grow. So language barriers and the vulnerability that a lot of the time results from language barriers are becoming significantly, increasingly impeding and hindering for more and more people around the world, which of course represents both an opportunity and also a responsibility for people who are language people in the language community and people who actually do have fluency and comfort in multiple languages. So let's talk about the United States. The United States is the country that has the highest number of migrants of any country in the world, with 51 million migrants, which represents 19% of the world's migrant population. Now, what do we expect, or at this point I wouldn't say expect, but at least hope? What do we at least hope from the country that receives the world's largest number of migrants? At least for me personally, my hope would be that the society that's at the receiving end of migration would focus and invest in capacity building for language diversity, competency, and cultural competency, right? I think that would be a very natural thing to hope of a society that's at the receiving end of a significant amount of migration. But the reality is the exact opposite. So the United States, in spite of having probably one of the most linguistically diverse populations in the world and having the highest number of migrants in the world, has the highest foreign language education deficit among all developed countries and many developing countries as well. So that's a huge contrast here. Highest amount of linguistic diversity and lowest foreign language education capacity. In the United States, 85% of students lack access to foreign language education before high school, which in a lot of countries would be considered unheard of. And the US federal government on the federal level spends $0 on initiatives to support multilingualism amongst youth, so before public school students get to high school. No investment. So when we talk about language injustice and the injustice that migrants and that refugees and that asylum seekers face, there's obviously a huge social and cultural element because you have societies that are not prepared to receive and to welcome the newcomer, societies that don't prioritize language education and language diversity. But then we'd also have to be living under a rock to not consider the policy issues, right? We all are reading the news. We all know what's happening from a policy perspective. And as language people, I think we need to really interrogate the ways that policy injustice, and policy injustice specifically as it's directed toward migrant populations and asylum seekers, is underpinned by language and the way that language is used as a tool for violent policy. So again, we're all hopefully have read the news and know what's happening at the United States border, and all of the injustices that are happening at the border right now with asylum seekers being detained, children literally in cages and in detention centers for weeks on end. But let's look at it from a language perspective. To apply for asylum in the United States in 2019, a lot of the times while being detained, you have to fill out a complicated 12-page form that is available only in English. It is literally only available in English, in spite of the fact that almost 0% of asylum seekers come from countries that are Anglophone. The form has to be filled out in English. Only in English, and it has to be filled out in English. And in order to even access the form, you have to pass an interview process, a credible fear interview process while detained, so while in detention. And in a lot of cases, asylum seekers are literally denied access to interpreters, at best, at worst, or at best are often given access to interpreters who are not high quality interpreters and who aren't qualified to be doing the job and who aren't vetted and filtered. And this concept of language underpinning political injustice and the use of language to make asylum more difficult, the use of language to make freedom of mobility more limited is actually nothing new. So literally during the time of the Holocaust, at which point a lot of my relatives were fleeing to different countries around the world, the United States State Department was under leadership of someone who was notoriously anti-Semitic and implemented a policy designed to make asylum more difficult, essentially using language as a tool. So they used paperwork technicalities to make asylum nearly impossible by implementing a visa application that was 8 feet long, so literally a piece of paper that was like this long, printed in tiny, minuscule type. And once again, in spite of the fact that the majority of asylum seekers who needed to be filling out this paperwork were not Anglophone and didn't speak English, the form was only available in English. So the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, HIAS, described this practice and the practice that was very similar in a lot of other countries besides just the United States, with the quote, "Many nations' failure to make asylum processes easier and more accessible ultimately led to thousands of deaths during the Holocaust." And Holocaust historian David Wyman called this phenomenon, or called this act, paper walls that meant the difference between life and death. So this is a quote about the way that asylum seekers were received or not received and treated during the Holocaust. But how relevant is it today, right? When there's all of this talk about walls, literal walls. But as language people, we also see these paper walls, these word walls, these language walls that are used as a tool to limit people's fundamental right to mobility and to safety. So let's pivot over to Europe, 2019 Germany. The nonprofit Translators Without Borders did research where they were analyzing the way that language underpins the European refugee response. And their findings were summarized with this quote: "Under-resourced translation and interpretation services pervades the entire European refugee response." Also in this study, they found that the majority of the interpreters who were hired by Germany's Federal Office for Migration and Refugees, meaning interpreters who were doing the highest stakes work you could be doing as an interpreter, because they were working with asylum seekers during their interviews, when asylum seekers are asked to share stories about persecution that they've lived in their home countries to prove why they're coming for asylum and the credible fear. These interpreters, the majority of them, were found by Translators Without Borders and by this research study as not having the adequate qualifications or language skills needed to join the German Federal Association of Interpreters. So basically the basic kind of baseline requirements you need to be considered just a decent enough interpreter. These interpreters did not have, and they're doing the highest stake work you could possibly be doing as an interpreter. They also found that a lack of female interpreters prevented survivors of gender-based violence from sharing details of their stories. So literally, people not sharing important details that would help to strengthen their asylum case because they simply didn't feel that they had safety or a safe space with the interpreter. So I think this really highlights the fact that the language person, quote unquote, is either the gatekeeper or the door opener. And as language people, we need to be thinking a lot about what that means, to be in the position, to have the responsibility and the privilege to be the gatekeeper or the door opener. And this is a case that actually made headlines in Germany. An asylum seeker who shared his story, had all of the documentation about the persecution and the violence that he had survived in his home country, and then was denied asylum after the interview. And when he was looking back at the paperwork to kind of analyze, what went wrong with this case, he realized that the interpreter didn't even know Arabic well. So the interpreter hadn't actually translated his case. He said he had missed important details. I couldn't believe it. It was barely my story. And these are interpreters that are literally allowed to be doing this work. So again, language, lack of access, which should be a basic right to quality translation, is underpinning the entire European refugee response. So what are the takeaways here, and why do I share this context and feel that this context is so important? Language is used actively as a tool for oppression, and as language experts, as a language community, as polyglots, as language people, we have the opportunity to use language as a tool for furthering justice, right? I think we're uniquely positioned, and not just uniquely positioned, but also responsible in a world that has so much injustice and so much language-based injustice to help build solutions that can promote the fundamental human right to freedom of mobility and to linguistic democracy. And so I want to talk about actually applying this in a few different ways. So we know that injustice, and specifically language injustice, is integrated across a lot of different axes: technology and tech democracy and language democracy on the internet, policy and language policy, and of course human organizing, sociocultural issues, language marginalization, language discrimination. So to the same extent that language injustice or language issues are integrated across a lot of different axes, the solution has to be integrated across a lot of different axes as well. So I want to share just a few examples of different projects that we've worked on at Google Translate, and I hope this will be the beginning and that we can all come together as a language community and think about more ways that we can get involved in our different communities at the local level, at the global level, at a lot of different levels and together. So does anyone participate in the Google Translate community or use the Google Translate community or contribute? Let's see. Has anyone heard of the Google Translate community? Okay, so good. Everyone, please make a note of the Google Translate community. So a few years ago, our Google Translate team started getting a lot of feedback that a lot of the results, and you guys are all polyglots, so everyone here knows that sometimes the results on Google Translate sound a little bit more like a machine said them than like a human said them, because that is the case. That is actually what happens. So in response to a lot of feedback that a lot of the times the results, especially in languages that are a little less commonly found on the internet, were substandard or not high quality enough, our team said, okay, this is an issue. Google Translate is such an important touch point to so many people who experience language barriers that can be really hindering for them in their daily lives. So we have to take action so that we can improve the quality of Google Translate and make it actually more human, make the translation outcomes more human and less machine. So we launched the Google Translate community, which is a crowdsourcing effort. You can find it at translate.google.com/community. It's a crowdsourcing effort where anyone who has the language skills, anyone who's bilingual or multilingual, in their spare time can input their own human ideas around translation. So literally there are different translation options, and you go and you validate them as someone who's multilingual, and all of those validations become crowdsourced, and then we use them to actually improve the machine, to actually improve Google Translate. So I hope everyone will take a few minutes at some point to validate some translations. It's also a good learning exercise as well. We now have over 1 million contributors, so 1 million people who are active users and regularly contribute to the Google Translate community. And it's a way to just, have a little bit of effort, because something you could do, some people spend hours and hours contributing to the Google Translate community, and other people just do it a couple minutes a day, a couple minutes a month. But it's a way to make a really big impact, because millions of users end up having a more positive outcome or a more positive result from Google Translate when you're contributing to the Google Translate community. Now, there was an insight that the Google Tel Aviv team brought to our team about Google Translate, which is that Hebrew and Arabic speakers had the highest usage rate of Google Translate. So they constituted the language population that was most using Google Translate, but relative to other languages, the lowest quality outcomes. So this is like a huge kind of juxtaposition where we said, how is the group that's most using our app also experiencing the worst user experience or the lowest outcomes? So we said, okay, we have to do something about this. And so led by the team in Google Tel Aviv, the team did a series of translation-a-thons in different schools all across Israel and all across Palestine, and schools that are Arabic speaking and schools that are Hebrew speaking, where students as a learning tool actually used Google Translate Community and produced different translations and validated different translations. And over 7,000 high school students ended up participating in this community organizing effort, and 4 million contributions to the Hebrew and Arabic tool resulted from this project. And the engineering team actually analyzed the impact on the way that the Arabic and Hebrew translation results. What was the actual impact of these translation-a-thons? And they said that there was a tangible and significant improvement in the quality of results. So I think it was a reminder that when we worked with the Ministry of Education, and so that was kind of the policy angle. We worked with students and teachers, which is the community organizing and human angle. And then we worked, obviously, with technology. And when we really work at that intersection, you can make tangible change when we talk about language democracy and access to quality translation. And then, because of so much active community involvement to improve Arabic in the Google Translate tool, we actually saw a very significant increase in the performance of the way that Arabic translates in Google Translate. And so we then identified that in spite of the fact that Arabic is one of the languages that is most used on Google Translate, the actual feature awareness amongst people who are using the tool for Arabic is relatively low. So product use is how many people are actually using the tool. Feature awareness is, do you actually get the most out of the tool? So as opposed to just typing in different translations, are you doing word lens, for example? Like, are you using it to translate documents? Because there's a word lens feature where your camera will actually automatically translate a document or translate a sign. Are you using the voice tool? Are you getting the whole experience are you using the offline tool? Because there's an offline capacity on Google Translate. So we realized that the feature awareness and people actually using the tool to get the most out of it was relatively low. So we launched a program called We Speak Translate, which we started in Arabic but then brought it out into other languages, which was designed as kind of a really quick curriculum that brings a new user through all the different ways to use Google Translate and to use all of the different features in all different kinds of life circumstances or situations. So in your daily life, in a legal context, working with documents, working to have a conversation with a healthcare provider, et cetera. And so we went through all of these different scenarios, and then we partnered with human rights organizations and activists and different organizations that work frequently with refugee and migrant communities to actually integrate these trainings into the onboarding materials that these communities provide and develop. But technology alone is not enough, and I think people who work at Google are kind of the first to acknowledge that. So there are a lot of, Google Translate, and there are a lot of other apps that are doing great work around translating, providing language services. I'm sure we can all name a few. Some of us probably work at a few and use a few. But technology is definitely not enough, especially for people who have language needs or who experience language barriers in some of the most vulnerable contexts or the most vulnerable environments. So as a response to this knowledge that technology is not enough, a coalition of technologists, Google Translate, team members, human rights activists, and members of human rights organizations, curriculum developers, and professional translators, we came together and we launched a crisis response translators network, which is called Respond, around the idea that as language people and language communities, we're not going to stay silent when we see injustice. We're going to respond. So we launched this network. I hope everyone will check it out. It's called respondcrisistranslation.org. And it's a network of volunteer multilingual people, not all necessarily professional translators, but multilingual people who are trained to respond in situations of emergency. And it's a network that works around the clock. It's global, so around the clock really works because a lot of it is remote, to do both in-person emergency response interpreting and also emergency response document translating for people who are experiencing language barriers in emergency situations or in really vulnerable situations, particularly people who are asylum seekers and need documents translated in legal contexts. And we launched this just 3 months ago, but we now have 3,000 volunteers and serve across 15 different languages, although we're building out right now our language repertoire because there's a lot of need for more. I see a lot of people taking pictures, which is really good, because I want to ask everyone here and everyone who's at this conference, if you feel that you have the language skills to participate and you have las ganas, l'envie, the desire to make a difference, to make an impact and to help, please sign up. Go to respondcrisistranslation.org and just go to get involved. And in the message, in the form, put that you are coming here through the Polyglot Conference so that we know that you're coming from the Polyglot Conference. And there's a lot of training that we do for the volunteers because the folks who are getting involved in this work, a lot of them are not professional translators, right? We don't all come from a professional interpreting or translating background. And a lot of folks who do come from a professional translating or interpreting background don't necessarily come from a background of working with asylum seekers or aren't necessarily asylum experts. So we do a lot of training, and these are the 3 key pillars that we center in all of our training. The first piece is socio-emotional awareness. So being aware of the different types of stories, needs, emotional needs that the person you're working with is bringing into the space when you're working. Even if it's remote and document translation, we include the socio-emotional awareness piece in all of our trainings. The second is trauma-informed and rooted in context translation. So becoming educated about the different contexts in which you're translating, becoming educated about the way that trauma shapes interactions because of the fact that the people that you're working with bring trauma into the space. And the third is self-care and vicarious trauma support. Have people heard of vicarious trauma? So vicarious trauma is the concept that translators who are working in really challenging environments or people who are translating in very challenging and difficult contexts internalize trauma, because essentially what translating is taking a kind of ownership over the words that you're listening to and then conveying. So vicarious trauma is this idea of internalizing the pain that you're working with. So we do a lot of work around self-care, around education about vicarious trauma and response to vicarious trauma, and around just generally creating a community where we can be there for ourselves and for each other. So now summarizing, I think there are kind of these 3 main takeaways that I hope everyone could walk out of this presentation with. The first piece is that, again, language experts or language people or language communities, we can be the gatekeepers or we can be the door openers. And so I hope that we'll all choose actively together to collaborate so that we can open as many doors as we possibly can. The second piece is that even in a really small amount of time, your language skills can make a huge difference. So even if it's just contributing to the Google Translate community or just contributing to some sort of different effort, whatever it is, or translating a document for a couple of hours of time, it's sometimes a relatively low amount of time and energy, but the impact that you can make on someone's outcome, on someone's life, can be really, really big. So as language people, we have to just remain grounded in this context that we have immense power to make change and to create impact and to build capacity. And finally, to the same extent that language underpins most social issues and most social injustices, language can also underpin the solution. So again, anywhere that we observe that language is being used to keep people out, to build walls and to close gates, we as a language community, as language people, as language experts have immense power together to open doors. So, gracias. Obrigada. Thank you.
I guess I'll ask the question. Thank you, Ariel, for your talk, and thank you for the passion that you brought to it as well. I think that you gave us a really good example of language activism right now in this room, so thank you for that. You kind of broached this topic when you talked about how when you were working on the Arabic and Hebrew side, you had collaboration from the government. They were helping you with working with schools and institutions. And then the flip side, you were talking about the United States, where even though Google is obviously huge in the US, there's $0 of federal spending on language learning. What do you think in terms of how that gap can be bridged? There's only so far that you can go working on that kind of tech scale and human scale. Eventually there is a need, or perhaps you don't think so, for governments to get involved and to kind of co-opt into the movement. How do we do that?
Yeah, well, of course, there is a need. I mean, we're reacting to that need, right? The fact that the United States government does not prioritize multilingualism, I think mirrors a lot of other issues around xenophobia and a lot of deeply rooted cultural issues. So I think our activism has to be everywhere. We have to fight for policy change, obviously policy change across the board, immigration reform, there's all kinds of different policy angles and different types of policy change we need to advocate for. I think like as language people, we can talk about language policy and advocating for the importance of teaching young people languages. But in the meanwhile, and while that's not happening, we have to do all this other stuff, right? So I think it's kind of a mix of continuing to advocate, continuing to push, obviously kind of counting our blessings when we get lucky in the Ministry of Education in Tel Aviv saying, yes, we're gonna do this project. But at the same time, kind of working around it wherever we can and building solutions on the outside. And hopefully building also collaborations, right? Because I think it takes a village. There are some people who are gonna say, I'm gonna dedicate my life to policy advocacy, maybe specifically language policy advocacy. And other people who say, no, I'm gonna build apps that make language more accessible, that make translation more accessible. And I think the more we meet each other, learn from each other, talk to each other, the better and the more kind of in partnership and in sync we're gonna be.
Hi, Ariel. Thank you so much for your presentation. I thought it was very meaningful to me because my parents in the 80s had migrated to Canada, and in the 80s, these tools that you mentioned, they didn't exist, and they didn't speak any English. So yeah, they also had a little bit of, well, actually quite some difficulty during the onboarding process or migration process. My question was, you had mentioned that tech is not enough. You had also mentioned that there was an organization like the Crisis Organization. In many cases, presently or maybe in the future, refugees or asylum seekers or migrants most of the time are not very savvy with cell phones. My parents to this day don't even know how to use a smartphone. So my question was, are there sort of outreach programs whereby you try to help certain people in need to be able to equip them with those tools so that they can right away themselves as well feel empowered and feel like they can bidirectionally translate certain documents or things that they need in order to get through?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for sharing that. And yes, actually, when we were talking about, for example, the We Speak Translate programming, the motivation behind launching that program was actually that we realized that even the people who were using the app to translate really across different languages. It wasn't one particular language. We just learned that a lot of people who were using the app on a very regular basis didn't have a full feature awareness, and that probably was related to tech literacy or digital literacy. So they were like, doing the bare minimum, like maybe someone that they know had downloaded Google Translate onto their phone at some point, and so they were doing really the bare minimum, but they weren't actually engaging with different features because they were afraid and they didn't know, and because tech is scary. So they weren't using the voice recognition feature, or they weren't using word lens to translate documents, so they weren't getting the full experience. So We Speak Translate was actually kind of a community impact project that we launched in order to increase feature awareness and use And we partnered, and these things have to happen in partnership. You can't be like this big tech company that's just trying to solve all these problems that in a way that's not community engaged or community based or community led even. So we partnered with human rights organizations and activists and experts and actually developed curricula with them about the different ways to use, in this case, Google Translate, although it could be a lot of different things. So use Google Translate, but then also just in general, like, you know, everything from the very beginning, from how do I download this onto my phone and what are all the different things that I can do. So it's kind of around like breaking the tech stigma or the tech fear a little bit, and obviously plugging into people who are experts and who are really engaged with different communities that we're trying to serve.
Very short comment to the previous question and the issue about the lack of multilingualism in the United States. Through a previous Polyglot Conference, I got in contact with a guy called Fabrice Jaumont, who works as the French education attaché. You've heard about him, you know him? Okay, I can see. He said that the fact that the federal government is not interested in furthering language learning, this is actually something that happens a lot also at local level, at regional level, and not least through parents that want more languages for their children. And he has written a book called The Bilingual Revolution that I can really recommend, because we need to, if we want to be language activists, we also got to get together, and a revolution, I think, is what is needed. Yeah. So that was about that. I also have a question. When you mentioned the, I work for the European Union, and I was curious about the Crisis Translate network that you talked about. So I didn't know about it, so I Googled it. Well, respond crisis translation. I put that into Google, and I didn't find it. It didn't come up. But there was a lot of other smaller initiatives that did come up. Some of them I already knew about. This is a small
initiative also. Especially if it's not coming up, it must be a small initiative.
Okay, well, I was just wondering what you think about strength in numbers here. I think these things are happening here and there and a little bit isolated. And if there is a way of finding synergies between the different very good initiatives that are going on in different places.
Yes, definitely. So first of all, try the URL, just so that everyone can find us, respondcrisistranslation.org. We're 3 months old. We're really, really new and also really small still. Yeah, so if you're Googling it, it might not be coming up yet. Again, we're small, 3,000 volunteers, 15 languages, and absolutely strength in numbers. If anyone here is working on similar initiatives, we should definitely be collaborating and talking to each other. Totally.
What a nice note to end on. Collaboration, talking to each other, I think, is definitely in the spirit of what we're about at the Polyglot Conference, and I think in the spirit of what we should be about generally as a human race. So thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you all.